Welcome to this ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series, and it's going to be two people you have to listen to today. There's going to be TV Paul from McGill University, and he's been here now for TV. It's your 10th year. Yes, yeah. So a very important part of our teaching here, and please welcome him with a big round of applause. And we're going to talk about a book that we co-edited, the two of us together, entitled The New Cold War and the Remaking of Regions. And I want to tell you a few things about the book, how it came about, the kind of questions that we ask, and then I'm going to hand over to TV. Overall, we're going to be about half an hour. And then we have ample room and ample time for questions and answers. Some time ago, TV created a research network, global research network for peaceful change, GRANPEC, and very sizable number of scholars and interested in peaceful change, approaching the project from very different kinds of angles. And there have been a lot of projects coming out of this research network, and this is one of them. It's you can order it if you're interested already online. It's going to come out in a month from now. A few things about the project itself, because you may say, New Cold War, what is that? Remaking of regions, how does that hang together? So a few introductory words about that. The first one, a new Cold War. That may be, I don't know, tempting for you to think, okay, so that's some historical stuff. You may think it's an analogy that overdoes things. Initially, really had in the title the question mark: do we actually live in times of a new Cold War? But let me tell you a little bit what we mean by that, and I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the new in the Cold War. If we look at the concept as such, then it predates what we now refer to the Cold War. It predates the confrontation between the superpowers after the end of the Second World War. It originates as a metaphor in France in the 1930s. And French politicians, they used it as a metaphor to describe relations between France and Germany. So after the end of the First World War, there was no longer a shooting war, as an American scholar called it, but it was a Cold War, guerre froide. So meaning that relations were still rather hostile, but there was no actual warfare anymore. There was no armed conflict. The weapons were put aside. We all know they were put aside for a while, and then obviously came the Second World War. After the end of the Second World War, you have an American foreign policy discourse, then the reappearance of this metaphor of the Cold War as juxtaposition, Cold War, shooting war. And obviously, when we look at the Cold War years, then there were certain things that were very peculiar about it. So when you look at the map there, then you obviously have two superpowers. We don't have that now. So now we don't live in a bipolar system, but we live in a multipolar system. And there are definitely three great powers: United States, China, and Russia. There are all kinds of rising powers. There are pivotal regional powers. So everything is in that way much more complex now than it used to be, not just two great powers, but nevertheless great powers that are very important for the system. The Cold War, we were very used to thinking of that in terms of ideological lines. And the ideological lines, we have one chapter in the book that investigates that in quite some depth, democracies versus non-democracies. But that also is a little bit more opaque now in this new Cold War. Yeah? So the ideological lines are not as clear-cut as they used to be. Another question that we look at very carefully is this question about agency from the great powers and from regional powers. So can we actually assume that these great powers can, so to say, lay down the law in international regions? There would be a traditional understanding of multiplexity, of multipolarity, sorry. Or is there a lot of agency within the regions, especially with regional powers? There would be multiplexity. Yeah? And here you can see already why we're interested in these remaking of regions. So we don't necessarily think that this remaking of regions simply is a top-down thing, where great powers can do whatever they want. Regional powers probably can do quite a bit as well. Most importantly, if one uses this as a historical analogy, then there's still no direct confrontation between great powers. Yeah? So this is where the metaphor again comes in. There's this metaphor, shooting war, Cold War, probably very important there. Keep one thing in mind though. Cold War does not mean that there's no conflict or no armed conflict elsewhere. Yeah? These great power confrontations usually come with all kinds of wars by proxy. They're fought then in the quote-unquote periphery, yeah? With horrible consequences. And we have a lot of wars by proxy right now, not only fought between these great powers or between great powers and rising powers, but oftentimes also regional powers. Yeah? So if you look at Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, for instance, they're reshaping the Horn of Africa in very significant ways right now, with a war by proxy that they fight in the Sudan. And one could give all kinds of other examples for that as well. Another difference is in terms of economics. Yeah? So obviously, during the Cold War, economically, East and West were very much divided. Now the world economy is much, much more interdependent. But nevertheless, depending on the kinds of indicators that one looks at, there are certain indicators showing that there is some kind of a deglobalization going on. Yeah? So we're talking now about this book. We don't have Trump, we don't have tariffs and everything in there, but it obviously is the backdrop of our discussion probably today, and there's a lot happening there economically too. So much about this concept of the new Cold War. Yeah? If anything, it's supposed to make you think a little bit. Does this historic analogy, this comparison make sense, yes or no? Yeah? And always keep in mind, so if one always compares apples and oranges. That's just what it is. Yeah? But it's important to reflect upon what the apples are and what the oranges are. The regions. So it really doesn't matter now at what world region we look at, but there is plenty of change happening. And the one map that you have there is the Asia Pacific. That is probably a region where a lot of change is happening right now, and a lot of change is happening that may really have repercussions for the world order more generally. Yeah? So we are used to looking, international relations scholars are used to looking at international relations, international order as a Eurocentric system. But if we look at the future, it's this region where a lot of very important things are going to happen, say relations between China and India, whatever happens on the Korean Peninsula, China, Taiwan, and so on and so forth. If we look at Europe, then we obviously have at the moment the problem, and we've had for quite a while, the problem of the war in the Ukraine. Yeah? With that, a fundamentally different kind of relationship between Russia, Belarus on the one hand, and other European states on the other. With this, the kind of organizational, institutional architecture of Europe has been shaken. Yeah, so Helsinki Final Act, OSCE, and everything built on the principle of the inviolability of borders, of existing borders. Yeah? Terminology that was taken from the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. Yeah? So to highlight very, very strongly that existing borders ought to stay in place. And the OSCE, if we walk over there today to obviously the headquarters there, very, very difficult situation to have some kind of multilateralism still ongoing. There's obviously a lot happening in the Middle East as well, yeah? Gaza, Yemen, Houthi, Israel, and so on. So a lot of violent changes in that region as well. And that has something to do with great powers, also with these regional pivotal powers. The Horn of Africa, again, a lot of massive changes. Yeah? Historically already a fragmented order. Yeah? So where states where governments find it very difficult to assert themselves, and where you have oftentimes a lot of rebel groups fragmented in themselves, militias, and this is almost the ideal entry point for great powers, regional powers, to wage their wars of proxy against one another. Yeah? And there's unfortunately a lot happening in this region right now. States within the region going against one another, states from outside the region intervening there, great powers intervening there. With these examples of regions, by the way, there is one interesting thing that you see straight away. Some of these regions, they really have regional players that have a lot of clout. Yeah, Asia Pacific most definitely. Horn of Africa much less so. So there's a difference there, so when TV is going to take over now, he's going to talk also a little bit about this multipolarity and multiplexity, and then you see that probably in some regions there's a little more agency than in others. So with that, I'm going to hand over the word to TV.
Thank you, Markus, for that wonderful introduction. And it's always a pleasure to be back in Vienna and address you guys. Some very bright students. What I like about it is the global nature of the program. When the world is becoming more provincial, you are still retaining your cosmopolitan, your notions of we are the world understanding, which is good. So this project actually was it took a while for us to come to this book, but clearly the subject is back. So after the Cold War ended peacefully somewhat, let's say 90 to 91 was the period, people assumed now that we don't need to think about this problem. But the problem never goes away. The problem of great power violence, great power contestation seemed to come back after a periodic period of relative peace. So many in IR, international relations, kind of gave up on it, leaving the field to people like John Mearsheimer, the IR students here would know that, who wrote this very influential book, The Tragedy of Great Powers, kind of forecasting that it's not over, they're going to return with much more vengeance. And so today, Mearsheimer is back in many ways, but we don't want to just accept everything Mearsheimer says or everything in that kind of offensive realist logic. We want to see the patterns that are emerging seem to be more complex, more diverse, and in a way, it's somewhat better than what you expect, because great power contestation in the past meant the second-ranking groups or states had little agency. So that's sort of the background here. But one thing is very clear, the great powers and their proxies, as Markus said, regional proxies, can do a lot of harm to international order, to regional order. So we look at our notion of peaceful change there's a maximalist version, then there is a minimalist version. The maximalist version or the minimalist version is basically stability, or people conduct foreign relations almost the same way, and that the norms of coexistence are practiced. But the maximalist notion is very much world order centered, that change happens, but also good change happens for the betterment of humanity. So what's happening in the world today? There is some change, obviously, the end of the Cold War, somewhat peacefully, then a period of American near unipolar dominance. Then 2008, 2009 financial crisis, there's a kind of a decline of that American dominance. The reassertion or assertion of rising powers, especially those in the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China combination. And so there is some level of transformation took place. And we can see that that's part of the challenge. Mr. Trump is actually, sometimes people think whatever he says is purely for domestic consumption. It's not really. He's also typifying this idea of status anxiety. The fact that the United States is on the decline, that others are catching up or becoming stronger. Therefore, try to arrest that kind of preemptive or preventive mode at this point. So there's kind of a radical revisionism that's coming from Washington, which is actually, to some extent, some people say, it's that success of the liberal international order that the other groups typify. And there is now a boomerang effect in the sense that success breeds discontentment, the losers and winners in this process, and that the uneven impact of economic globalization on the domestic constituencies, different kinds of constituencies, is part of the challenge. So when you look at the liberal order as a Kantian order with three components to it, you have the importance of democracy, institutions, and economic interdependence. All were working to some extent to create this sort of Kantian world, but globalization accelerated that process of economic change. Some benefited, many countries, rising powers in particular. At the same time, class formations occurred within the established power, that's the United States. And then you have the rise of China. Obviously, that rise is something that is unusual this fast. The previous historical experience are Germany's rise or Japan's rise. But the fact that China got there so rapidly, quite a bit thanks to globalization and its insertion into it. But the point is, China cannot really claim to have all the paraphernalia yet, but its ambitions under an ambitious leader has definitely changed. So the last statement by China, fighting to the end, that the US will someday buckle down, that China can certainly create a space for itself. So the notion of staying power is very important. Will the US stay longer enough to wage this battle? And the point is that the US may have less staying power than assumed by looking at Mr. Trump's backing off from threats of tariff, and one day he's with one tariff, the other day he's backing off. This is a problem with the democracy, that staying power can be limited, and that's partly why the US lost in Vietnam or in Afghanistan. The opponent has more staying power because of the strategy they adopt, and obviously that is a big challenge. So from globalization to deglobalization, and if globalization is a multi-layered process, economic, technological, political, social changes, leading to what you call a global expansion, unprecedented, and the activities beyond states and regions. And that obviously would create the kind of new social classes, new forces, etc. But one topic that is neglected by this focus on globalization is the dynamics of status in international politics. So what happens when new players arise, when the old ones decline or proceed to decline? You have this problem of status discrepancy, ascribed versus attributed or desired status. And that changes when the material capabilities change, increase. Countries want to be recognized for their status. And when they don't get it, as Putin shows, they can go really mad. And they can engage in such aggressive violence towards those who are challenging their status, by the way. That's very important. So Ukraine, unfortunately, fell into that category of a state that is challenging the Russian dominance in a status context. I'm not justifying any of that, by the way. So the US fight now is fear of status loss, that it would lose the way it is going. And so partly the reading of it is based on a diagnosis that others are benefiting disproportionately, therefore let us change it. So what we are witnessing is the great powers are back. And the great powers are known for one thing, that is a sphere of influence. They have a problem with it. They may say we are for sovereignty, sovereign equality, all that stuff. But when it comes to core belief, a great power is a great power because it has a sphere. Without that dominance, this is a traditional reading of it, that it cannot claim to be a great power. It cannot claim to be part of a hierarchical system where it is respected, feared, if you want to call it both. And so that's kind of back, and some of the readings you get by these three powers and principal powers is about that. China wants the South China Sea as its Indo-Pacific as its sphere, which is contested by India and Japan and others, US in particular. United States wants its sphere of influence widened, including Canada, if possible, get it as a 51st state, or Greenland. And sometimes they end up in wars in the past because they go too far, but that's a big change. A great power war is very costly. It wasn't like this in the past. When countries go to war in the past, they never expected World War I, even World War II, to be that bloody as it proved to be, World War I in particular. So where are we now? And Markus mentioned some similarities, some differences. What we are seeing is this contestation of norms happening, when there are also institutional structures changing. We'll come to some of that in a minute. So the problem is the great powers are not able to achieve their goals easily in the current order. We call this multiplex multipolarity order, which is a little bit different from the previous understanding of polarity. So in other words, even though Russia and China and the United States are powerful enough, others are there with some agency. There is India, there is Japan, there is Germany. There are players within it that cannot easily be co-opted as the great powers did in the past. This is partly because of material change. These new players have some capacity, but ideational change as well. So they are no longer willing to just oblige to the great power. And you notice that there is hardly any new alliances are formed, military alliances. It's very difficult for a great power today, especially a rising power, to form a military alliance. China, look at it. Who is with China in a sense? So China is very clever though, but the Belt and Road Initiative is its strategy of avoiding that and getting into a kind of sphere of influence. Yes, the United States has formed coalitions with the already existing coalitions, whether it is Australia, Japan, or Korea. The India one is the newest one, but that is not a military alliance yet. And India does not want a military alliance. It's very unlikely India will fall for that. It wants to retain its autonomy, hoping one day it would become a great power by itself. By the way, I have a new book on the subject, if you're interested. The Unfinished Quest, India's Search for Major Power Status from Nehru to Modi. So we are in a kind of a multiplex Cold War. great powers exist, pivotal regional actors exist, and they are vying for influence without placing their security and economic prosperity fully in the hands of one or the other great power or blocs. And the blocs themselves are declining, as the European bloc, NATO, I think is in decline. So we are in a kind of, I wouldn't call it a transition phase in a big way, but clearly there is element of order transition happening, and we don't have a full picture. So all we can say is this new era is bereft with uncertainties. What are countries doing? And that is what is interesting. And I think it's also important to see some of the weapons countries, the great powers have, they are trying to use. So what Mr. Trump is doing is kind of weaponized interdependence, realizing that he has certain power, and that power is coming out of the extraordinary economic power the US holds, the dollar, etc. So re-establishing the American primacy, unfortunately with an imperial side to it, blatantly attempting to change that. And I think the danger is resistance will grow, even though now they may make a deal today, tomorrow, but I think the challenges are going to increase very heavily as we grow advance, especially if it is going to hurt a lot of states in that process. So as I said, the ideology of even MAGA, of course, there is a right-wing populism happening in many democratic states. My own sense is some of it is immediate reaction to the economic loss different classes experience. Some of it is the fear that we will lose this contestation with China, therefore let us prevent that through these structures. That ideology need not succeed in the long run. It is unlikely to bring rewards to these countries. Maybe some groups within succeed, because whatever they are saying, their outcome need not fulfill the ambition they have. And that is because, unfortunately, the laws of economics doesn't necessarily work. To keep up the growth, the momentum, the autarkic idea of development is very difficult, especially in the development of new technologies, in the selling of products. And so some level of globalization ought to survive. Otherwise, we are going to get self-defeating situations. We say institutions are failing, but you notice that every institution annual meetings, they are dying to attend. G20 or they are there, Asia Pacific. What are they doing in these institutions? So this is a big difference. Institutions may have lost power, especially UN, but the alternate ones, the G20, the BRICS, they are not necessarily doing a whole lot, but the point is that it is not a total disaster when it comes to institutions. It's yet to be seen if the US will abandon the UN or will cut off all the funding. That happens, my sense is some other alternate institutions may be structured. I think the US would lose considerably its soft power, its power to lead. Then it will try to enter some other administration, may be quite hard. So this institutional architecture is part of the new Cold War, or the changes happening, and which I think is transition in many ways, but institutions are not dead, partly because institutions are needed, either new ones or reformed ones, to face many challenges the world is facing. And institutions also offer status to newcomers. That's why India wants to get into the Security Council, Japan, Germany, all of them want to get in, even though we know that Security Council has lost its power. But there is something to it. So the norms are evolving, and the sphere of influence norm is a big challenge today. If you look at who wants these norms, sphere of influence is hard because direct conquest is hard. You need to go the indirect way. Direct conquest is hard because even the weakest state in the system have something to offer. So I take the case of South Asia, which probably you know, India and China are contesting the smaller actors. There are tiny states. There's a state called Maldives, which is a beautiful place to visit if you have money, because it's very expensive. There is Nepal, there is Bangladesh, then there are islands in the Indian Ocean, Seychelles to Madagascar, etc. China is trying to, definitely Sri Lanka, I didn't miss that, to influence them, many of them. Same way India. So they have elections in many of these places. One time they will elect a pro-China government, the next time a pro-India, because it is part of their big domestic contestation between political parties. Neither China nor India has been able to establish a military base, make them part of your alliance. These small states are playing off these two, getting as much aid and support. Doesn't mean they're progressing well, because they have a lot of corruption and the domestic situation is bad. But the point is, in the past, India could go and tell Maldives, behave. That's not feasible today. And that is a big change from what I see, the agency of the small, the weak. And we don't know whether it will stay on like that unless you go for a military conquest and try to intimidate them. But that's not possible, because there is a balance of power between China and India. That is one that one cannot easily break. If they do that, then they will engage in contestation. Now, this is what is happening with the US and China to some extent in Latin America, for instance. Latin American states' #1 trading partner is China. The US is trying to use the old Monroe Doctrine, but the US cannot really impose its will even on Panama, the country that is threatened beyond a point. And so this norm of sovereignty, sovereign equality, that is, the small states are somehow internalized very powerfully, and they're holding on to it. And I cannot say for how long, but it definitely has more agency. They have more agency today than any time in history. Okay? If you look at the history, the great powers, the colonial powers, the imperial powers, they had the upper hand. And that transformation we are not capturing sufficiently from the agency of the small states in some of the writings we see in this period. So what are they doing? What are their strategies? Of course, the big powers use what you call hard balancing, military alliances, build up, by the way, using a lot of new technology, AI and drones and chip-based ideas. And I think that's going to get them quite a bit of power over time. And they're also engaging in technological denial or expansion, cyber AI chips. But the weaker parties are using institutional coalitions, soft balancing, or creating limited understanding, India, Vietnam, etc. And I think that strategy will continue, because the way to defeat Trump is not through military competition. The United States has an edge, money, but through delegitimation. And delegitimation is feasible through institutional structures or soft balancing coalition. It may not produce immediate results. Of course, a lot of uncertainty here. So the problem with the Trump strategy is unilateralism or neo-mercantilism, removing reciprocity, and the fact that the American power is purely not hard power based, it's also soft power based. And if you destroy that, and some of your assets are your institutions, your education institutions, your technology, your scientific community. So the long run decline is possible, unless in the next election somebody will rectify that. But there are people who believe that Trumpism will continue in some format because of the way the electoral map is set up in the US. A lot more electoral power to people in the city or the states where Trump is dominant. So recently there was a book by Klein in the New York Times reporter. He has a great podcast, by the way. And the book, with another co-author, argued, which I think there is some truth to it, the Democrats or the liberals are very poor in running cities. So go to San Francisco, go to New York City, all run by Democrats, liberal. And people are leaving those places, and somehow they are moving to areas where there's less population, Texas and places like that. And until these liberals can produce results, there may be a challenge, and their politics of left-leaning politics turns off the traditional coalitions that are very conservative, religious ideas, etc. So, US strategy today is based on some level of bringing back the old ideas of military grandeur, technological superiority. But I think some elements may succeed, but majority of these strategies could fail because there is enough competition coming from China, for instance. So the Chinese strategy is very smart, if you want to call it from a great power contest. It's Sun Tzu, very much get there without a fight. So the Belt and Road Initiative, some call it a new East India Company, is an East India Company without war, to get there without really conquering directly, but indirectly. But the question how long they can sustain that. And so that is big change when you look at how great powers in the past contested. European great powers contested, and Russia today contesting. So there is a certain amount of power that China has in the technological area, critical areas like AI, the electronic vehicles, etc. And the fact that no one can abandon the Chinese trade relationship easily, which is a big difference. The reason is that the Chinese companies produce the cheapest components for electrical goods, for manufactured goods, and pharmaceuticals. So India has been trying to get rid of that relationship, but it's impossible. Every year the trade is in favor of China, trade balance. And the question is why? Indian companies cannot exist without Chinese components. No Indian company can produce them that cheap. So that is a struggle even the United States is going to face. Can the companies produce internationally competitive products without Chinese components? So we don't know how long this will last. Of course, some level of innovation and technological innovation can produce things. But I think there is a limit to what they can achieve in the short and medium terms. Then it is Russia. Again, a status challenge that it wants to reclaim its dominance over these ex-republics, and is relying on nuclear deterrence, creating conditions for these other states to sort of bring back its great power status and divide NATO. Yes, some level of success there, but people believe that that success will not last long without additional material capacities. Its material capacity, if it is based on this coercive power, how long you can do that. So this new Cold War, there is some level of regional conflict, but you notice it's not as bad as the Cold War itself. There are Americans and others who argued that Cold War was a peaceful era. Those who come from the global south would say it was the most violent period, one of the most violent periods in history. 40 million people died in the global south countries, largely due to these interventions and unnecessary wars the superpowers engaged in. So that today's world, it's confined to, we just showed some maps, some regions, yes, Middle East in particular, Persian Gulf, and of course some simmering conflicts in the East Asia world. But overall, the number of conflicts has not grown that badly. I mean, it's just that we focus more attention on some of these conflicts. There is a lot of possibility for technological contestation, economic contestation, and economic downturn producing different forms of conflict and structural conflicts. Non-great power states are using alignment, some of them, but non-alignment still back in some sense. And so they are hedging. And they are hedging with their different instruments, may or may not succeed. They really want to create more institutions, more institutional power, which in a way is good, because the rising powers abandoning institutions along with the established powers will be bad news for world order. So what is the emerging world order? What will it look like? We are very much in a phase where a new equilibrium, is it possible? And based on our reading so far, it will not be a replica of the previous Cold War, because alignment is not easy to form. You cannot become militarily part of another coalition for reasons that really don't bother you, which was not the case the Cold War. You had this bifurcated world on ideological level. You don't have that. Luckily, both China and Russia don't represent a universal idea of messianic idea, and the West is losing interest in the liberal messianic idea to some extent. So it will be contestation, but it will be a different kind to some extent. And alliances are not easy to form. And then, of course, whether US strategy would succeed, my sense is may go on for a little bit of time, but over time, if the US dollar, yesterday Warren Buffett said that dollar will be the #1 casualty if things go like this, and some other currency emerges or some other ways to handle the global economies, then that will be a big fall because the US debt will worsen. So all that suggests that China may have partial success, but not Tianxia or the typical tributary model that China would like to create, because there are too many players in the Indo-Pacific. There is India. India has its own agency, its own capacity in the Indian Ocean. So the Southeast Asian states are the most vulnerable. They still can trade with India, and there is obviously the US, some amount of that will succeed. So new institutional structures may be needed, and that includes the G20. Some argue that G20 is better than Security Council. Security Council is frozen. There is no way it can be expanded, whereas G20 may be, not clearly representative, but at least a large chunk of the world is representing there. So what is the world order will look like? I think it will be, or we think it will be multiplex, which means like a theater, you have different movie theaters. Within a theater, you have different movie places. Of course, some are small, some are big, but they coexist. And hybrid, because economic arena, you may still have a partial globalized world with a lot of challenges there. But you will get some efforts by some of these countries to obtain national power, national autarky. So one strategy for everyone is to prevent the rise of a too powerful state, whether it is the US or China, that the second-ranking states should have some agency. And that, by the way, include the European Union. The European Union need to figure out a bit more grand strategy, how to compete with these two without losing its liberal credentials. But for that, the Europe has to innovate. Europe needs a better grand strategy without getting too close to either camp. And of course, population is a challenge to Europe. There are a lot of internal challenges here. But I do think that there are multiple possibilities for different actors as we enter the second half of the 21st century. So I stop there.
Thank you, TV.
That's our table of contents. You can see what is in the book.
And that's great. All right, so now you have the chance to ask whatever questions, make whatever comments you want. I'm always gonna
introduce also.
Yeah, and I'm always gonna bundle 3 of them. Please introduce yourself quickly, and then either one of us or the 2 of us, depending on the question, perhaps can answer. To make it easy for you, let's start with Milan on the front.
Hello, my name is Milan Gajic. I'm from Serbia, and I'm a master student here at Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. This was very inspiring, and thank you for this lecture. You said that democracy is the reason why the US lost the war in Vietnam. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Did I say democracy or I forgot?
No, I think it was not democracy. It was. But I mean, you can.
That's one question, but
Yeah,
I have another
yeah,
one. And you said also that the great
Okay,
power,
I got it now.
Yeah.
that the great power cannot claim that it's a great power without having its sphere of influence. And do you think that that's the reason why Russia started the war in Ukraine, because she lost its sphere of influence there? Thank you.
Good questions.
And then I think William, you had your hand up, no? Yeah.
Hello, William Southworth, MICE 1 from the United States here. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was very interesting. I look forward to reading your book when it does come out here soon. I did have one question, which you sort of alluded to there in the conclusion, Professor Paul. Now, is it possible that a party other than China could hypothetically reach the great power status of truly global reach, that were incomparable to the colonial great powers, in the sense that they might be able to enact a Belt and Road Initiative program of their own? Is that a hypothetical we could consider? For example, I know it's been a few years, I think it's been a few years since you released your Unfinished Quest section about India, but could India, for example, be in that position? And supposing if we do get to that point, what mechanism would a new great power use to have its status recognized? Would it be through the UN, or would it be another mechanism? Thank you.
Thank you. And then we do a 3rd one. Yeah. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Markus from MICE 2. I come from Denmark, and I want to ask whether you think that the term New Cold War is an accurate and useful way of describing the current geopolitical tensions, or if there's a degree of superficiality to that term. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm gonna start with the last one, and then yeah. It's Marcus, from Marcus to Marcus. It's it's a way of trying to reflect upon things. Yeah. So there is this. There's a nice quote by Goethe: "Vergleiche hinken." Yeah. So comparisons limp. Yeah. They always do to some extent. But if you use them in a reflective way, they can help you get somewhere. The important thing for us to really get a discussion going is to take the new very seriously. Yeah. And then there are these similarities and differences. Yeah. Some of which I've discussed, others I haven't discussed. Yeah. Another similarity that I think I haven't mentioned is nuclear weapons. So that's an important one. Yeah. So that's and in that way, if one talks about a new Cold War, then that is I don't want to say optimistic, but I mean at least it says okay, so it's unlikely that we're going to get into a doomsday scenario in terms of nuclear weapons. Yeah. Which, by the way, one may say, okay, so there's been all kind of nuclear posturing of late. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Russia, Ukraine, one of them, India, Pakistan, TV. You may want to say something about that later. Where even we're going to get to certain limitations there, yeah, where it may get quite dangerous. Yeah, this is also something that one with this metaphor one could think further. Yeah, so obviously during the superpower confrontation, there were also Cuba, one example. Yeah, so these crises are bound to happen again. Yeah, and in our view, TV put also strong emphasis on that. So the new Cold War is a multiplex world order. Yeah. So it's not the kind of thing where you can say, okay, now this is the monolithic world order and looks the same everywhere. But it is multipolarity and multiplexity, and the two come together, and the two come together differently in different movie theaters in the same cinema, the international order. Yeah? So it is different when you look at Asia Pacific or at the Horn of Africa. Yeah? So it seems to be that some of the contributors to the book, they focus for the most part on regions where there is quite a bit of agency, yeah, and because you have to make choice, you can't write on every, you can't have contributions in every world region. But sometimes this multipolarity weighs more heavily, yeah? And sometimes perhaps the regional agency from actors, pivotal regional powers from adjacent regions, the Gulf and the Horn of Africa, for instance, also weighs more heavily. So overall, it is a more blurred picture, or more vague picture, perhaps, than the kind of superpower confrontation with these two. Yeah, although even there, yeah, one mustn't be too caricaturistic in that way. Yeah, so it's not the case that during the Cold War, Moscow and Washington had everything firmly in their hands. Yeah. So, say during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Fidel Castro actually had plenty of agency, and used that in ways that didn't help to de-escalate the crisis by in any way. Yeah. So, it's a way to think about what our current world order is like. Yeah. And it's a way of trying to invite discussion about it. But I think we think this multiplexity, multipolarity, there is something to that. They come together in quite complex ways.
So your question, it's not that democracies are weak in fighting asymmetric wars, for instance, but I was talking about staying power. Staying power is low because you have elections happening, domestic constituencies want change, and then you also have very casualty insensitivity. Sensitivity is very high. So people dying in large numbers, then the constituents want to get out of it. There is a problem of exit strategy, which all the democracies have faced. They don't go into these conflicts with a proper exit strategy, which is impossible because that's the nature of asymmetric warfare. I mean, you can argue that Russia also withdrew from Afghanistan under very similar circumstances. But the point is that the interventions are happening, especially by these Western powers, often based on short-term illusions, if you want to call them, that we can achieve our goals and then exit fast. And that's what I meant by, but it's not a normative questioning of democracy. I'm still a believer in democracies, but democracies get into these, the Western democracies in particular, without the ability to conclude it because of the nature of the conflict. Is Russia? Absolutely, Russia is seeking sphere of influence, return to some kind of sphere. And Russia's grouse or complaint is that the West is unwilling to give that, and the European Union does not believe in that kind of sphere of influence. And so the Ukraine saga is, if you go through that, it's Russia's rectification of its status humiliation by the West, whether it is NATO expansion or whatnot. Whether it will fulfill this deal that Mr. Trump is trying to sign, will it fulfill Russia's ambitions? Some believe not, because if you succeed in one domain, why should you stop? There is a temptation to go with the Baltic states next or whatever. And especially if this is your primary goal in life, okay, the state is now so focused on rebuilding the Russian empire in some fashion. So, but I think it has limitations, the simple fact that how many players are willing to form that coalition with Russia. I mean, occupying that was another question, whether the colonial mechanism, I think That's a very weak mechanism. I think some places it may succeed in a limited way. But colonialism as an ideology, as a normative force, had a lot of legitimacy in the past. The Europeans somehow, European colonial powers, created a world order where colonialism was a normal way of doing business. Before that, it was slavery. Okay, these institutions got repudiated. And now if you want to reclaim, I mean, you can't just say, I believe in slavery tomorrow and start enslaving people. That doesn't mean it's not happening in the limited pockets. How will you believe that's going to happen? There are considerable challenges to recreating the colonial world, partly because there is resistance, normative resistance, ideological resistance, and even the weakest parties can resist with different strategies. So I don't see that coming back. Maybe in some pockets it could. So what's the mechanism? The biggest mechanism is inclusive institutions, where these guys have some role to play because they want to be recognized as top dogs without the kind of coercive power that often went with the top dog. And I think that is a challenge because institutional accommodation often is limited in scope, because as the material power advances, states want to get more recognition. But as we mentioned, the institutional structures are not meant for rapid reforms or accommodation of rising powers in such a fashion to fulfill their cravings. So it's going to be very interesting what institution will survive, what institution will become the place where they can accomplish their goals. But what is interesting, regional institutions still exist, and they are going to be playing a role in many ways. The question about the Cold War is just simply its absence of hot war. So it's a metaphorical in some sense, that you have all the elements of rivalry. Today, China and US are in a rivalry, okay? But it is not hot, or it is not the same as the previous era. They are trading, which means that even though that may be curtailed over time, societal level, yes, there are some blockages now. So many elements of Cold War exist, but not the same way as the previous one, which was total, no? Which was ideological, the containment was total, no trade between the East and the West. We may get there to some extent, but I doubt it because, as I mentioned, China is still a big player in the global economic order. You cannot shut it out because many of these other states that US is trying to impress will not fall for it because their economies would suffer if China goes away, until there is an alternate system whereby they can get these goods for their own commodities, production, etc. So it's a complex world order. Let us not simplify it as Cold War, or, that's why we were very uncomfortable calling it even a multipolar order, because that's a very European era. When I say European era, I'm talking about the historical era, centered idea that we are entering a situation where there is some level of great power rivalry contestation. But one condition that could change is one power becomes overwhelmingly superior with its technology, with its military capabilities, and there is nothing to balance it. And that is a big challenge, a possibility, because technologies are changing very rapidly. But technologies are also spreading. It's not easy to hold on to it too long, unlike in the past.
Next round. Who wants to come? Wants to go next? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Juan Borrero. I'm from Colombia, and I'm a MI student here at the Academy. My question has two parts. So the first one is, how do you assess the role of middle-income countries that are not necessarily part of the BRICS in this what's the word you're using?
Multiplex.
Multiplex world, and what's their agency? And the second
You have
part,
particular countries in mind?
yes. Well, they're listed by the World Bank, but like the Asian countries, I saw them there. So Thailand, the Philippines, Indonesia, I could go on. Egypt, Morocco, Colombia, Mexico. I could keep going. So, and the second question is, if there is a new Cold War, is there also a new non-alignment movement that is coming precisely from these kind of countries? Thank you.
This we're gonna gather. So I'm gonna do 2 more. Then yes, 1, 2.
The 2 guys sitting in the front are trying to get her attention, but
We'll be
she's
eventually.
behind.
Eventually, we'll be.
Thank you very much for the lecture. My name is Christina. I'm a business student, and I have 2 questions. First, a realistic Russian president, considering its economic power and military power of Russia, what possible status can it claim for itself? Because military, it might be powerful, but economically, it is declining and nothing seems to stop it. And my second question is, I do believe that the European Union can transfer into a military power on the long run because of its economic potential. But does it work the other way around? Given that one country might be powerful militarily, in military sense, can it also transfer into an economic superpower? And yet again, I'm thinking about Russia, that can it be economically a flourishing country just because it has 6,000 nuclear warheads, put it simply. Thank you.
Thank you. And then in the front.
Good evening, Professor. My name is Chetan, MICE 1 student, and thank you for the presentation. So my question is, when we say a new Cold War, I think there's at least some implication that there is this particular game, and there are 2 countries that are going to play this particular game. But we think it is the US and China, but does China even desire hegemony to begin with? Does China really want to become this global hegemon by playing this Cold War game and defeat the United States and attain global superpower status? Because if such a thing was reality, then this is the time for China to act. We don't see China sweeping into sub-Saharan Africa and South America and sway these states towards its ideals. We don't see China building a blue water navy to replace the United States as the leading maritime guarantor and safety protector of the world. So, and when China invests in Belt and Road initiatives, I mean, is it because China wants to sway Europe to its side, or is it because China is the world's largest exporter and a lot of Chinese people work in China's export sector, so it just wants to increase exports? So are we interpreting a lot of actions that China does for its own regime security as moves in a particular Cold War? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. TV, shall I start or do you want whatever?
I can give it a shot and then...
Yeah.
Actually, your question about these new institutions, BRICS and G20, both of them have expanded to include some of these countries, not all of them, which is a smart idea because they realize that they cannot hold on to the status hierarchy for too long. They need these middle-income countries. I think they have done better than the established institutions like the UN or others. So they are showing that accommodation of the rising middle-income countries is possible. I'm not saying it's perfect or they have a lot of agency, but clearly that's happening. Whether non-alignment is feasible, well, non-alignment has always been a strategy of countries. The problem is non-alignment in the military sense, yes, that's happening. But it is not an organized grouping at all, because organized groupings would require active diplomatic meetings and engagements, and as the non-aligned, the G77 at the United Nations, resisting all the efforts by the established powers for asserting their role. That's not happening. I think countries are in a waiting mode. But I am not ruling out a certain amount of non-alignment even among the so-called Western allies. Canada, for instance, because it has no incentive now to fight American wars, And so it is possible some form of, they call it strategic autonomy today, which is happening in many countries. Everybody wants as much autonomy as possible, whether it is through non-alignment or some other strategy that is yet to be seen, but we will not see the exact replica of the past. Russia's status loss, status gain. By the way, leaders need not read things the way we read. They may have a calculation based on their history, who are advising them. There's a lot of literature on this. Advisors of Putin telling them, you can go back to that civilizational power. That's happening in India too to some extent. Based on your history and all that, sometimes they selectively pick those things that really justify their position. And so just because an outsider thinks they need not achieve their goal, in fact, that is not necessarily how leaders they see themselves. They are hoping that whatever assets they have, unfortunately the asset is, as you correctly pointed out, very skewed. And so if it is a comprehensive national power, it will lose, but it has certain agency, certain capacity to create conditions such that it will still be recognized by the existing great powers. That's what they are trying to play with Trump, and he's giving them some level of status back. How far they will go, I don't know. Can the EU transform into a military power? If the common enemy, common threat becomes unbearable and impossible without an alliance coalition, that is feasible. But can the EU transform into an economic power? I will leave that question to Markus, because there's a lot of anxiety in people in the writing about these things, that the EU has not come up with, there's no Apple in Europe, as far as we know. There's no big companies or innovators sufficient. Okay, there are smaller ones. That innovative spirit of EU has to come out. I don't know how easy that is. You can answer that question. Does China want to be hegemon? Well, going by their progression since the peaceful rise, you know, Deng Xiaoping said, lie low until, sit until you can stand. Deng Xiaoping's strategies are partially abandoned today. Okay, there is a kind of a peaceful rise there still. Under Xi Jinping, the ambitions have massively transformed. By 2049, when the Communist Party's 100th anniversary of takeover, China would like to be the lead power of the world. It may not play according to the European great power system, which is what you're comparing. They should have started, you know, we have a whole set of power transition theories which sort of argue that when that rising power reaches a certain stage, it will accelerate by starting a war, preemptive war. And that is not happening, which is because Chinese strategy is based on different views. It's not a Clausewitzian frontal warfare, but it is, I believe, it's Sun Tzu. It's art of war without really fighting the battle. So whether China wants to be a hegemon, it will be a different hegemon. It knows that if it can continue this dominance in technology and economic power. That's a big if, because others can catch up. Technology may not remain in the Chinese hands. Others could come up with the strategies. And even the US itself, with the different coalitions it can form, it's actually forming a kind of sub-balancing coalition with India, for instance, partly because of this idea that China can be contained to some extent or balanced, if not completely restrained. So the Chinese goal may not be the German goal of 1910s, but it is certainly there, a desire to be going back to this notion of Tianxia, which, by the way, nowadays scholars even question that, because there was no proper Tianxia existed in the system when they talk about. There were multiple players in Asia Pacific, by the way, and that India was a big player in this Indosphere. There's a new book, William Dalrymple's book talks about it. There were Arab, there was Mongols, you know, the different players were coexisting in Indo-Pacific. So, but the sinologists have made it sound like it was all China dominated. Not really. I mean, it's not clear that's the case. So that's one great thing about Indo-Pacific, that it may be very difficult for China to assume that kind of a superior role as much as it may want to. I'll leave it to you.
Now, just two little things to add. One on the non-aligned movement. Yeah? So if we look just empirically at initiatives by the non-aligned movement recently, they're basically stuck, right? So right to solidarity declaration, they've been working on that, I think, for over 10 years. If one looks at disarmament, nuclear weapons and everything, doesn't look very good. And one of the reasons for that may be that we are moving more towards this kind of minilateralism, yeah. So where small number of actors come together, like BRICS, for instance, and they have it easier. And it's interesting if one thinks about this in terms of this multipolarity, multiplexity thing, yeah. So great powers, regional powers. It seems that for the rest, it's gotten quite difficult. I've talked to diplomats about it, and they repeatedly ask this rhetorical question: where's the new middle? So non-aligned movements sometimes could, also neutral states, they could place themselves somewhere in the middle between great powers and try to get something going. Yeah, and I think in our days that has become much more difficult. With the European Union, yeah, the economic power into military power. Historically, sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't. Yeah, so Venice was during its prime, economically speaking, a great power, but never militarily. This has probably led to its downfall. Yeah, and with the European Union, one can think about this in terms of scenarios. Yeah, so one would be along what you suggested. So there's this external threat, and then countering, balancing against this external threat that European states come together. And obviously, if one would add up everything, so in terms of population size and military hardware and everything, then the EU would not only be a formidable economic actor, which it is, but also a militarily one. It's just that the problem with the EU is always that it's very, very easy by others to play a divide and rule game. Yeah? And we see that whenever matters of peace and security are discussed, especially in crisis situations, where the EU struggles greatly to come together. So I suppose there are two scenarios, yeah. So coming together, coming not together. Normatively speaking, I would be very, very happy if I could claim that I'm very optimistic about the coming together scenario. But I'm analytically speaking, I'm probably a little less optimistic about it.
On non-alignment, I have one more point to make, which is, you remember the 1950s? It started with the Bantung process, then. Of course, non-alignment was formed in 1961 with the Tito. You had very powerful leaders to lead that movement. You had Nehru, you had Sukarno, you had Tito, very gutsy people, Nasser. So that is missing today. I mean, even countries may be interested, but who will bail the cat? It requires a lot of gutsy movements. You know, Bantung was a very gutsy thing. I don't know how many of you know about it. 1955, 50 plus countries met in Bantung, Indonesia, and declared that colonialism should be ended, racism should end, world should enter into a disarmament phase. Nehru gave a big speech there, supported by, actually China was also there, invited, Chao Enlai. And all the great powers, the superpowers were there. In fact, propagandizing, vilifying Nehru, please don't do it. We need this Cold War to win, therefore we need your support. And he received a lot of threats from United States and other countries. So today's leadership is weak on the global stage to create that momentum movement. I'm not saying it can't happen. Of course, crises produce leadership, by the way, over time. So there is a big difference with today's so-called middle powers in that context.
Anyone else still wanting to ask questions?
Final.
Or are you happy? Are you happy? Good. Okay. No, William, one more, very quickly.
Oh. And that will be the end of it, I guess.
It came, again, William, nice too, but it came as sort of as a footnote here, but this concept of deglobalization. Now, obviously it was talked about in the context of Trump and the tariffs. Are there the geopolitical ingredients right now for deglobalization to become essentially a characteristic of the global economy and essentially segregate it to the point where we could see a hot war? Or is economic interdependence likely to stay, or guaranteed to stay, I should say?
Deglobalization is happening in some sectors. So I think globalization or truncated globalization is here to stay. There is no other way, because many of these players, including China, India, Japan, Korea, they need trade. And so even if the US market is tight, they may form different other arrangements. So living in Canada, I know for sure they are now talking about we need to get out of this 80% dependency on the United States. So they are actively looking at potential markets. Britain to European Union, they made a mistake by giving up on China and India. So there is some consideration, maybe we need to reclaim that Commonwealth relationship with India and change things. So for trading states, there is no other route, because your domestic population is so small. You got 40 million people, but you are the 8th largest or 9th largest economy, Canada I'm talking about. How do you maintain that 70% of your income comes from trade or GDP? So this is a necessity for countries. So truncated in the sense some domains may seem constraints imposed by states, but then there will be realization that you are losing out. US, for instance, the contraction of the GDP will be at least 1% the way they're going next year. And that is, if it is 2.5 to 3% growth, 1% going down will be substantial for American economy. So what will happen is there will be sectors, the technology sector I can see, pushing hard for some level of globalization to continue. They succeeded. The Apples and the Microsoft all succeeded because of globalization. Doesn't mean that the average person is benefiting, because if you don't work for Silicon Valley, you are not going to benefit from it. And so my sense is this is a historical process. There is the 1920s, there is this two step forward, one step backward situation. And there will be always societal groups, classes benefiting from global expansion, and then some losing. Karl Polanyi's famous book about great transformation. So there will be contraction in the way things are done, but then there will be new social forces emerge claiming that you will lose, we will lose if you are not part of the global network of technological development, trading, etc. So the best hope for globalization are these rising powers. They cannot abandon it. If you want to become rich, how are you going to do it? With your own autarkic policies, which they tried, by the way, for a long period of time. China and India were not allowing anybody to enter their market. So I have hope that they will carry on. The 2008-2009 rescue of the world happened accomplished by the BRICS. People forget that. The US was in deep trouble, by the way. Obama tried to resurrect later on. So this is where multiplex come in. There are a lot of people in the world who are not interested in purely playing this game the great powers or the United States wants to play. They may be sidelined for now, but I think they are going to return, because common prosperity, however unequal it is, cannot happen without some level of globalization.
Yeah, let me just add a few things. That was our last joint project before the book was a special issue in international affairs on deglobalization, so it's a great question for us. But the way how we dealt with it there is really looking at very different dimensions of globalization, deglobalization. So let's say you can look at viruses, and they are very much globalized. Yeah, so they don't ask for a visa somewhere at a state border. Not even Trump can can mobilize his border people to do something about that. There is an understanding, where sometimes in the literature referred to as a global animus, an understanding that the world is globalized, intersubjective thing. That definitely is declining. Yeah, so there's this in terms of economic indicators, most show that it has plateaued at a high level, and some indicators, foreign direct investment, during certain years they have gone down. If one thinks that democratization is a globalizing process, so that more and more states become democratic, that has been reversed about 2 decades ago. Yeah, so it's a very mixed picture. But your question was a lot on the economic side, and there I would cite with a lot of things that TV has said. Yeah, so with the caveat that this understanding that the world is globalized, that underpins a lot of policy decisions, and if that's no longer there. So the thesis advising for the whole day today, there were a couple of theses on Florian. I've seen you somewhere. No, there on basically how nationalism how nationalist discourses take over, and so this understanding of globalization gets pushed aside. Yeah. That obviously has certain repercussions, and whether one can uphold then the economic flows of globalization, those kind of circumstances, I don't know. But to some extent, we're living through this right now. Right? So terrorists, taking them back. What is that going to do to these globalization flows?
It generates a lot of angst for people living through. We are actually, luckily, we are not in 1920s. Imagine your forefathers in this territory, what a world that was, thinking about, or even 1910s and war is a possibility. At least that much we know that that will be suicidal for any great power to engage in war of that magnitude. Doesn't mean crises or limited incursions. And that is a big change. The second thing is, look, it's never linear progression towards freedom, democracy. We think that democracy is undercut. My concern is that people really want freedom, whether we like it or not. Over time, there will be demands for regenerating this democratic spirit. See, the democracies failed in providing collective goods as they're supposed to do, and then everybody knows most democracies are corrupt, and there is a lot of oligarchy running the show. So there's a lot of accusations that democracies are not truly democratic. They are procedurally democratic on paper. They need to be more democratic. So, but liberal ideas are contested. There is no doubt that liberalism is going through a phase. In fact, in this special issue, I argued that liberalism had been so far successful in adapting to different changes. Through war, to winning the war was very important, by the way, the Second World War. But that need not continue. No ideology can exist forever. Ideologies do adapt, do change. So a form of liberal ideas still are needed or will be needed. But if it goes to the extreme, then you have this boomerang effect that is happening today.
On that note, thanks a lot for your discussions. TV, thanks a lot for being here.
Exactly at 8 o'clock.